All right. Last week we covered the Nephilim, and I had a couple of comments at the end of class last week about maybe going over some of the scriptures that I just referenced rather than actually going to. There was a little bit of confusion with some of that. So just very quickly, as we noted, the term Nephil, from which the concept of the Nephilim comes, is only mentioned 3 times in the Old Testament. Once in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 4, twice in Numbers 13 verse 33. Both of those times is translated giants, at least in most translations, most of the word-for-word translations. Some translations do actually put a proper noun to the term Nephilim. So in some Bibles, I don't remember which ones, but they have Nephilim actually translated there, which is a little inaccurate given the context of the term and what it's being used to describe. As we noticed in Genesis 6 and in verse 4, as well in Numbers 13:33, both of these would seem to have indications regarding giantism, individuals who were born with increased size, and with that size certainly would come strength as well. In fact, Strong's defines the term as a feller, a bully, or a tyrant. Remember, we talked about this term Nephal in Ezekiel 32 and in verse 27, and a lot of people who adhere to the Nephilim concept go to Ezekiel 32 verse 27 to help give commentary from Genesis 6. So they have this preconceived idea about what Genesis 6 is about. Then they go to Ezekiel 32 and verse 27 and say, well, this is talking about the Nephilim, those who fell. And of course, the concept of Nephilim is about these angels who fell to earth because they rejected God. And certainly we do know in the Bible, particularly Peter and Jude, refer to angels who fell from their proper abode. Certainly we know that there were angels who did rebel against God, and presumably they did come to serve Satan, which are the demons we read about in the New Testament. But there is no reference to the demons ever taking physical form, living on earth, and somehow mating with the women of the earth and having these divine hybrid children. And that's what the concept of the Nephilim is all about. It's a pseudo-mythical, and ironically, it's a Jewish origin, at least as far as we can tell, that the first references to the concept of the Nephilim as being these kind of hybrid type of children comes from places like the book of Maccabees, or I'm sorry, the book of Jubilees, as well as the book of Enoch, both of which are very apocryphal, the very spurious writings in terms of what they record. But we notice in Ezekiel 32 and verse 27 that term Nephal is actually, we find that term 434 times in the Old Testament. It means to fall, or those who have fallen. But it's more of a verb, to fall. And we notice the context of Ezekiel 32 as being about this list of uncircumcised that God pronounces judgment against. These warriors who, in their culture, they would have been exalted as heroes. They would have been noble warriors who died in the defense of their king and their people, but God calls out judgment on them. And in particular, in Ezekiel 32 and verse 27, he calls out those who had no honor even while they were living, and would have no honor when they died either. And so I think that's important to note as well. So as we noted in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 4, the actual context would indicate that we have these sons of God, which again, only what's often brought up is that phrase sons of God is almost always used to describe angels. And that's true. You only find this exact phrase, I think it's like 5 times in the Bible. It's twice here in Genesis 6 and then 3 times in Job. But Job is the only other one who uses the phrase. So just because Job uses it to describe angels in Genesis 1 and 2, and I think chapter 31 or something along that line, that does not mean Moses is using it that way. So we have to be careful of taking the definition as Job is using it and describing it here. Sons of God in the New Testament, or children of God in the New Testament, never refer to angels, not once. It's always Christians. So it's important to note. But what we find in Genesis 6 is all about the fall of the service to God among man. How that man is turning over to sin, turning over to lives of idolatry. And all of that kind of helps us to understand that the sons of God, these were faithful people who were intermarrying with the daughters of men, and we see this same exact trend, the same kind of copy and paste over and over and over again, where faithful people may marry individuals, particularly women who may be of idolatrous nations, and they end up turning their heart away. You think about Samson. Of course, Samson, I mean, it's debatable even before he got married as to where his mind was, but especially after he married the daughters of the Philistines, it doesn't seem like he really was all that quote-unquote moral, I guess you could say. You've got Solomon. Okay, Solomon, because of the many multitude of wives that he married, all of them seems to have been from which they were all from other nations, led his heart astray. There are many examples of this that take place, and it sounds as though, and certainly would fit the pattern that man seems to go along with anyway, that's what initially led to the flood regardless, and then it continued even after that. Just never perhaps to the level that obviously the flood was at. In Numbers chapter 13 and verse 33, we talked about the families of the giants. And these giants, there was one particular giant who was referenced by name, whose name is Anak. And not to say that he was the father of all giants, but the fact that for the individuals who the Numbers is being written to, they would recognize the name Anak, particularly from the Anakim, which we'll talk about in just a second. But that's in reference to the flood. I'm sorry, not the flood, to giantism. Numbers chapter 13, verse 33, we mentioned the fact that this is the other place where twice the term Nephilim is found. Well, that's in direct context of the giants who were sons of Anak. And there is absolutely no way to understand Numbers 13:33 in the context of Nephilim as it's being portrayed as being these hybrid human beings. It just doesn't make sense there. And so the fact that Numbers 13:33 seems to be directly relating giantism or giants in the land, and that's what the spies came back and reported. Remember, that's what the context of Numbers 13 is. That certainly lends credence to the understanding of giants in Genesis chapter 6. Remember, we talked as well that Genesis 6 particularly may not just be a reference to the giants themselves as being giant, but also the character of those people. Remember, we talked about this term. It means one who is a feller, one who is a bully or a tyrant. And the term is never used in a good way. It's never used in a positive light, except in Job. Obviously, we're talking about angels. But the concept here Nephil wasn't used in Job, but the concept of the sons of God was used in Job. But here in Numbers chapter 13:33, that concept of individuals who were violent, individuals who were bullies, individuals who used their strength and their size against other people, certainly that would connect to the context of Genesis 6 regarding the downfall of man's character and man's morality, I guess you could say. And then we just talked about Ezekiel 32 as well. Now, in 1 Samuel chapter 17, I wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that these terms seem to specify or indicate reference to giants and giantism, and certainly the components of their morality or character as well. But in 1 Samuel chapter 17 and then verse 4, we have the record of Goliath.
The account in Genesis 6, that's before the flood, right?
Right.
Now, where'd they come on after the flood? Where'd they come from then?
Well, I think the genes in Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and daughters, all of that genetic or DNA was very saturated. Okay, I think all of the DNA from all of the races that we have today, okay, as well as giantism, I believe were contained in all of those people. Now, over time, as each generation developed after the flood, some of those DNA that kind of came out, like with these families of the giants. And of course, many of these giants would have tried to find others like them to have families, which then propagated into the Anakim and so forth. And so I think that when you look at or consider the fact that we have so many variety, I guess you could say, of human being, both in certainly skin tone, but in other aspects to that as well. The genetic structure of what started with Adam and Eve and then restarted with Noah and his family, those 8 souls, it must have been much more saturated, much more condensed. And then over time, a lot of these other DNA, aspects of DNA started kind of spreading out and being more applicable to entire families and entire groups of people, not just all contained within 8 individuals like with Noah and his family. Okay, so the giants referenced in Numbers chapter 13, for instance, that are referred to as living in the land of Canaan, obviously these weren't giants who survived the flood. No soul survived the flood except for Noah and his wife, his 3 sons, and their three wives. That means these giants had to come from a lineage of either Ham, Shem, or Japheth, and within that bloodline contained the genetic code for giantism. And then it just kind of propagated from there. Now, it's not nearly as common today, giantism, and I think that's because as we've got, 7 billion people or so on the earth, all time, maybe 8 or 9 billion people who have ever lived, okay? When you have that much genetic propagation taking place, it's going to get a lot more spread out. You're not going to have as much of that opportunity, I guess you could say, for giantism and things like that. That's just a thought. Obviously, that's not said so in Scripture. It's just kind of a makes sense type of thing. All right. So in 1 Samuel chapter 17 and verse 4, we talk about the Philistines. The Philistines were not anything exceptional. Philistines were not giants in of themselves. But what we do see in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 4, a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. That's 9 feet 9 inches tall, at least according to our understanding. Cubit was measured from the fingertip, the end of the middle fingertip, to the end of the elbow, usually about 18 inches. So that's generally, a cubit is 18 inches long. And then a span was considered from, I believe it was the wrist to the elbow, I think is correct, is 9 inches or so. And so that's 9 feet 9 inches. So that's how tall Goliath was, which is interesting given the fact that we use the term Goliath as an adjective. Okay, we use it to describe things. It was gigantic, it was Goliath, it was, things like that. I've heard the name Goliath used as an adjective. But Goliath was just named Goliath. It doesn't have any special meaning to it. But it has kind of introduced itself into culture because he was so big. But he was unique, it sounds like, among the Philistines. Notice he was one of the champions of the Philistines, meaning he was exceptional, he was different. And it sounded as though this is kind of a common thing that they would do. Hey, if you want to challenge us, challenge our champion first. See if you can take him on. We see he had a bronze helmet on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. Now, we mentioned before that his armor, a shekel kind of varied over generations in terms of weight, between 7 grams and I think it was 15 grams. And so, depending on how they were defining a shekel at that time, that was between 150 and 200 pounds. Think about, that's his coat of mail, or his breastplate is what that's referring to. That's heavy. 200 pounds. If we're looking at max weight, 200 pounds, that's a lot of weight. Most football players would be incredibly proud just to bench press 200 pounds. I mean, that is a lot. And so to think about this is something he wore not just one time for a couple minutes. He wore it all the time and would go out to battle with it. Now, certainly this also meant that he was probably pretty slow, and most of the giants probably were. But that's how strong this guy was. Very, very impressive. He had bronze armor on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. The staff of the spear was like a weaver's beam. His iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. Now, we talked about the spearhead as well, or the spear. This is just the spearhead, would be between 15 and 20 pounds, or 25 pounds. So that's not including the length of the shaft of the spear, which you talked about like a weaver's beam. Don't know exactly how long the spear was altogether, but the fact that just the weight of the spearhead was up to 25 pounds. says something about just how strong and how intimidating this guy was. And you got to figure that for the Philistines, they wanted the Israelites to see Goliath. They wanted them to be intimidated. This would only serve them theoretically good because they felt nobody could take on Goliath. And of course, anyone without God probably couldn't have. But David did, as we know. So that's Goliath. Now, what's interesting is in 1 Chronicles chapter 20, as well as in 2 Samuel 21, we have the sons of Goliath and the brother of Goliath mentioned as well. I can't do two things. 1 Chronicles 20.
I think that some of our athletes, they grow up bigger than maybe some other kids, and they start being conditioned by either coaches or parents to be an athlete, where there's no doubt to me that he was not conditioned.
Probably not.
From a youth.
Right.
So that, if anything, he was strong because he's been doing it all his life.
Well, consider just if someone like that were born in our society and he didn't have maybe the health conditions, because giantism, especially today, someone who is diagnosed with giantism, generally speaking, their organs are not, they don't come along for the ride. So giantism today is really more of a curse than anything else, because generally speaking, people like that do not live long. Most individuals with giantism die young. Okay, I think that one of the oldest on record, at least within the modern age, is maybe 55 or 60 years old is pretty much the max that they can live. Because usually their heart is too small to be able to pump blood to all of those extremities, as well as the rest of their organs for that matter. But if, say, Goliath existed today and went through all of the conditioning that an athlete could go through, just to imagine how imposing this fellow would have been. 9 feet, 9 inches tall. Doug, how tall usually are the standard door entrances? They're what, 7 foot? Okay, 7 foot. So you figure it would have come to about, what, right here or so, the top of our door frame to get into the auditorium on Goliath. That's not to mention how wide this fellow probably was. I mean, his height, it wasn't like Lurch, who was tall but scrawny. I'm guessing this fellow was tall and big. So you got to figure this guy was massive, especially given at the time, most of the heights of these fellows that we're talking about, even the Philistines as well as the Israelites, it's been estimated that Saul was probably no more than 6 foot. Remember, Saul was head and shoulders above all the other all the other Israelites. So you got to figure most of the Israelite soldiers are probably 5'6" to 5'9", maybe somewhere in that range. Goliath is almost double the size, double the height than the Israelites. And it just boggles your mind to understand. That's kind of why we have visual aids for our kids to understand just how big this guy is. But most ceilings, they're only, 7.5 feet maybe? 8 foot? Okay, you can't even really unfold Goliath all the way out to really understand how big this guy was. Okay, he'd stick up another 1.5 feet, more than that, almost 2 feet above the ceiling of most standard ceilings. That's crazy. In a 10-foot ceiling, where some people have 10-foot ceilings in their homes, especially if they have a recessed fan and things like that, his head would be 3 inches from the top. That's crazy. In 1 Chronicles chapter 20 and in verse 4, it happened afterward that war broke out at Gezer with the Philistines, at which time Sibbecai and the Hushathite killed Sippai, who was one of the sons of the giant, and they were subdued. Again, there was war with the Philistines, and Elhanan, the son of Jair, killed Lami, the brother of Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Yet again, there was war at Gath, where there was a man of great stature, we're not given his name, with 24 fingers and toes, 6 on each hand and 6 on each foot. He was also born to the giant. Presumably, we're talking about Goliath. Okay, the Goliath being the giant is being referred to here. So when he defied Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, killed him. These were born to the giant in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. So notice, obviously, there was a family here. Now, they must have taken up residence among the Philistines, presumably, at least at the time of that battle being referenced earlier. We're talking about the In 1 Samuel, we're talking probably just Goliath was there. We're not told that Lami, his brother, was there with them at that point. But regardless, you've got his brother, but then you have these 3 sons as well. And the fact that we're told about the strange nature of one of his sons, he had 12 fingers, he had 24, he had 6 on each hand and 6 on each foot. So he had 12 fingers and 12 toes. That seems to suggest to me, or seems to corroborate the idea of this being a genetic thing. And certainly genetic abnormalities like that still happen, but far, far less than I imagine they happened hundreds and thousands of years ago. Those things like that probably weren't a problem. Today, they would be more of a problem because that's all the more blood that the heart has to pump to those digits. So it certainly stood out, and it even stood out then, the fact that the writer of 1 Chronicles even pointed it out, saying this fellow was a little different. He had 24 digits. Most people only have 20. Any thoughts through that? Okay, so then the other, or the parallel passage is 2 Samuel 21, which is actually important to note because 2 Samuel kind of helps record a little bit of other aspects of this. 2 Samuel 21 and in verse 15. When the Philistines were at war with Israel, David and his servants went with them and fought against the Philistines, and David grew faint. Then Ishni-Benob, who was one of the sons of the giant, the weight of whose bronze spear was 300 shekels, who was bearing a new sword, thought he could kill David. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, came to his aid and struck the Philistine and killed him. Then the men of David swore to him, saying, "You shall go out no more with us to battle, lest you quench the lamp of Israel." Now it happened afterward that there was again a battle with the Philistines at Gob, and so Sadocai, the Hushathite, killed Saph, who was one of the sons of the giant. Again there was war at Gob with the Philistines, where Elhanan, the son of Jeroorgim, the Bethlehemite, killed the brother of Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Yet again there was war at Gath, where there was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number. He also was born to the giant. When he defied Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, killed him. These 4 were born to the giant in Gath and fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. Now this says that these 4 were born to the giant in Gath. So either, and there's a couple commentaries that talk about the fact that this concept of whether or not there were 4 children or 1 brother and 3 children, either way, you've got the brother whose name was Lami, or the 4th child, presumably, was Lami. But then you've got Sippai or Saph, he's referred to as both in both of these accounts. Ishni-Benob and this unknown fellow with the 24 digits. But when you notice some of the specifics about how much these things weighed and all of that Samuel and Chronicles brings out, it kind of gives you an idea that maybe even among the children of the giants, not all of those children born to them are necessarily as big as the parents were. It sounds as though, at least with this fellow, maybe he hadn't worked out as much as Goliath had. Maybe he was much younger than Goliath, so Goliath may have been bigger and stronger. But at least this one fellow, the spear weighed 5 to 15 pounds, whereas his father's spear weighed 15 to 25 pounds. That's a pretty big difference. Thoughts or comments through that?
David started something, didn't he?
Huh?
David started something, didn't he?
Yeah, he started, and
Nothing impossible.
right. And what's interesting about this is the fact that you've got all of these giants. It seems as though there come certain points where some kings and armies deliberately target some of these giants. I mean, if you go up against the army, you want to know where their strengths and weaknesses are. And if you know that there's one particular aspect of that army that is just going to destroy you, you want to target that somehow. Okay, you can't just avoid it, you have to target it somehow. And it would seem as though, as we're going to talk about in Genesis, it seems like not only were some of these giants targeted specifically, but also the fact that entire groups of giants were kicked out of the land of Canaan at the very least. I don't know if they were completely wiped out totally during that time, but at least they were targeted and war was made against them because people were afraid of them. And I don't really blame them. I mean, I wouldn't go to war with them, but they did, because they did not want to have anything to do with them because these giants were that scary. And of course, remember the term for giant. Okay, first there's Nephil, which is a bully or a tyrant, but then there's also a term named called Imim, which means terror. All of these terms for these giants carry with us this very scary negative connotation with them. And it's notable that that's the case, because that's how people thought of them. That's how they referred to them, which also suggests why they targeted them. Ben?
Kind of go back to what Doug was saying about these giants before or after the flood. Think about whether it was genetic code or whatever, the providence of God. He knew his plan. He knew he needed to show his anointed in David.
Yeah.
And on down the line with the people of God, Israel.
Yeah.
He needed something like that.
But, and that's a great point to show, it took David killing Goliath for his name to really kind of have this reputation with it.
Be glorified.
To be glorified, yeah. And then because David trusted in Jehovah and glorified Jehovah throughout all of that, David's reputation grew even more. And so certainly that, as Doug mentioned, kind of here's what David started, that kind of built up into recognizing that with God's help we can defeat, doesn't matter who it is, we can defeat them. Just as Joshua and Caleb reported to the people, even though they didn't listen, hey, it doesn't matter if we're like grasshoppers in their sight, we can defeat them with God's help. Deuteronomy chapter 3 and verse 11, we have a particular giant who is mentioned named King Og. And in verse 13, right? Verse 11. We have, only King Og of Bashan remained of the remnant of the giants. Indeed, his bedstead was like an iron bedstead. Is it not in Rabbah of the people of Ammon? 9 cubits is its length, and 4 cubits is its width, according to the standard cubit. In this land which we possessed at the time from Ur by the river Arnon, half the mountains of Gilead and the cities I gave to the Reubenites and the Gadites, the rest of Galilee and all Bashan, the king of Og, or kingdom of Og, I gave to half the tribe of Manasseh. All the region of Argob with all Bashan was called the land of the giants. Now, whether this is referring to King Bashan remained of the remnant of the giants of that particular family or tribe, or out of all of the giants, I thought it was all of the giants because they're referenced later. So King Og probably would have been of a particular kingdom or that particular region. He was the last of those giants. But notice that this bed frame, it remained for a period of time. I mean, it's an iron bed frame. Talk about solid. But then talk about it's having to support King Og, who, if 9 cubits was its length and 4 cubits was its width, as we talked about last week, a California king-size bed is 6 foot by 7 foot. Okay, kind of gives you an idea. A regular king is more square. It's more like 6.5 by 6.5. But California king is 6 foot by 7 foot. Well, King Og's bed was 6 foot by 13.5 feet. It gives you an idea, first of all, of how tall this guy was, but also maybe a little bit of indication how wide this guy was, how big this guy was. I'm sure he was proportionate to his height. So you got to figure, this guy was huge. And the fact that they had to create a bed frame, or somebody had to create a bed frame to support him, okay, this wasn't some wobbly little iron bed. I'm sure this was pretty sound, pretty, solid iron, cast iron type of, solid iron type of thing. And the fact that the writer of Deuteronomy, Moses points out, is it not in Rabbah of the people of Ammon? It's still around. Okay, this was something that almost people used as a decoration or as something that, hey, look at this. Check out what there was a king who once slept in this. I just think about that. But I think it's interesting that every now and then we have some of these specifics. It's not just that the Bible, the Old Testament, that God had it recorded that these giants existed, but we're told how big they were. And to me, those specifics, they don't just come out of nowhere. It just kind of goes to show that God wanted us to know not just that they were quote-unquote giants, but what did that mean exactly? They were big people. And the fact that they don't really exist like that anymore, or at least not in the amount of numbers that they did, says a lot as well. Okay. Now, there were a lot of different families of the giants. There are several mentions of the Anakim, which literally those from Anak. We talked about Anak earlier in Numbers chapter 13, about these giants being the son of Anak. Anak would apparently have been a major patriarch or a major father of a lot of these families. But the Anakim specifically, Deuteronomy chapter 1, I'll go back, and in verse 28, let's see. So here we have the, this is as they're looking at Canaan. It says, you complain of your camps before the Lord hates us. He has brought us out of the land of Egypt, delivers us from the hand of the Amorites, to destroy us. Where can we go up? Our brethren have discouraged our hearts, saying, the people are greater and taller than we. The cities are great and fortified up to heaven. Moreover, we have seen the sons of the Anakim there. Now, the sons of the Anakim, again, Anakim, it literally means sons of Anak. Okay, so these wouldn't maybe necessarily have been the direct sons of Anak that they're seeing, but maybe the grandsons, great-grandsons, at least the descendants of Anak that they're seeing in Canaan, according to the record of what they were talking about. In Deuteronomy chapter 9, and in verse 1, the Anakim are mentioned as well. Hear, O Israel, you're to cross over the Jordan today and go into dispossess nations greater and mightier than yourself, cities great and fortified up to heaven, a people great and tall, the descendants of the Anakim, whom you know, and of whom you heard it said, who can stand before the descendants of Anak? Therefore understand today that the Lord your God is he who goes over before you is a consuming fire. He will destroy them and bring them down before you, so you shall drive them out and destroy them quickly as the Lord has said to you. I think it's interesting you have this phrase, he's a consuming fire, which is actually brought up again in Hebrews chapter 12, which I think is interesting given the fact that there's both Old Testament references here. But the fact that they're to go up against cities that are great and fortified. Now imagine how big some of these cities had to be, just of necessity, to accommodate 10-foot tall people. I mean, if Goliath was an indication, some of these people would have been up to 10 feet at least. And I would suggest King Og, I mean, you wouldn't make a bed and still have 3.5 feet on the end of it if he's only 10 feet tall. It's possible King Og was up to 11, 12 feet tall. So some of these buildings, at least having 10-foot headroom, probably more than that, because you'd have to have a 10-foot doorway entry and then taller ceilings than that. So imagine how big some of these cities had to have been, how imposing those cities would have been. And then he just specifically describes the people great and tall, descendants of the Anakim. Well, who can stand before them? That describes the intimidation of their stature and how powerful they were. In Joshua chapter 11 and in verse 22, again the Anakim are mentioned. Joshua chapter 11, there we go. Joshua 11:22. So after they had come through Joshua, he's kicking people left and right out of the land of Canaan. None of the Anakim were left in the land of the children of Israel. They remained only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had said to Moses. Joshua gave it as an inheritance to Israel according to their divisions by their tribes, land rested from war. So again, it's not that necessarily all of the giants were killed per se. They were just cast out of the land of Israel. There were still some in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. And of course, that's going to come up later because ultimately Goliath's going to come from that group of people at some point. And so that talks about the Anakim. Then we have the Rephaim. The Rephaim in Genesis chapter 14 and in verse 5 is mentioned. In fact, Genesis 14 and verse 5 is a very important passage because it describes a bunch of these. Notice with me, we talked a little bit about this last week. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and attacked the Rephaim and Ashtoreth, Karnaim, and the Zuzim and Ham, and the Emim and Shava Kiriathim. Anyway, all of these groups, the Rephaim we know were giants, because there's references to the valley of Rephaim, and in the same book, the reference to the valley of the giants being used interchangeably. So the Rephaim were giants. We know that the Zuzim, we know the Emim were giants. because those are referenced as terrors, which we'll talk about in a second. The Zuzim would seem to have been the Zumzimim, possibly the same ones that are mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 2. There are entire families, entire groups of people, of giants, that this king in turtle armor is going off and he's fighting a war against all of them. Deuteronomy chapter 3 and in verse 13, Raphaim is actually mentioned there. Deuteronomy 3 and in verse 13. So we talked about this. The rest of Gilead and all of Bashan, the kingdom of Og, gave to half the tribe of Manasseh. All the region of Argob with all of Bashan was called the land of the giants. This term giants is the Hebrew word for the Raphaim. It's the same exact term, and that's why I said sometimes it's used interchangeably, the valley of the Raphaim and the valley of the giants, because the same term is used. Whether it's translated Raphaim or giants, it doesn't matter, because it was the same. They were the same people, and that's what's being described here. And so that's whether King Og was of the Raphaim specifically, or there was some kind of association there. That's what Moses is showing here in Deuteronomy chapter 3. And so there's some of these connections that I think are really interesting. I talked about the Valley of the Giants and the Raphaim. You see that in Joshua 15, 2 Samuel 5. The Imims are really interesting. Deuteronomy 2 and in verse 10. Deuteronomy 2 and in verse 10. So we have, the Lord said to me, verse 9, do not harass Moab or contend with them in battle. Remember, we talked long ago about Balaam and Balak, yeah, and how that they hired Balaam to come down and curse the children of Israel, and yet as they were coming out of the land of Egypt, God told them, do not go up against Moab, but Balak didn't know that. He was afraid of the children of Israel. He was of Moab. He was worried they were going to attack him, but God had told them here in verse 9, you are not to attack Moab, because that was the children or that's what I gave to Lot. So then in verse 10, the Imim had dwelt there in times past, a people as great and numerous and tall as the Anakim. So we know that the Imim were giants, just like the Anakim were. They were also regarded as giants like the Anakim, but the Moabites call them Imim. Interestingly enough, this term Imim, it means literally terrors. I thought that was a really interesting, the Hebrew word term here for Imim means terrors. The Horites formerly dwelt in Seir, but the descendants of Esau dispossessed them and destroyed them from before them, dwelt in their place, as Israel did to the land of their possession which the Lord gave them. It's interesting that the Horites are mentioned also in verse 12. There is some indication that the Horites, I didn't include them in this list, I don't think I did. Yes, I did. Possibly the Horites, even though there's no direct reference to the Horites being giants, they are listed amongst lists of other tribes we know that were giants, like the Rephaim, the Anakim, the Imims. So the Horites very possibly could have been. Possibly the Zuzims, we see those in Genesis 14, which may be the same as Deuteronomy 2 and verse 20. So we have kind of a very same kind of situation here in verse 19. That was also regarded as a land of giants. Giants formerly dwelt there, but the Ammonites called them Zamzumim, a people as great and numerous and as tall as the Anakim, but the Lord destroyed them before them and they dispossessed them in their place. Now, there's a possibility that the Horites and the Zuzims, or Zamzumim, were all the same people, and they're just referenced differently based on who called them what. But regardless, the point is you've got a whole lot of individual tribes and families of giants. And to me, going back to the initial concept of the Nephilim, if we're going to talk about the Nephilim, this is what we're talking about. All of these tribes and families of the giants, that's what the Nephilim were. Although certainly there were some before the flood, we also know there were some after the flood, Numbers 13, at least using that term Nephil. So the Nephilim, to me, would be all of the giants together. If you're going to refer to all of them as one, okay, I would refer to them as the Nephilim. So if somebody asks you, well, what about the Nephilim? We can talk about, okay, well, let's talk about Genesis 6, let's talk about Numbers 13. They were the giants. All right, Next week, I will have notes, Lord willing, on Sunday for everybody. We're going to be talking about the 7 churches of Asia for our character study. So starting next week, we'll start with the church at Ephesus, Revelation 2, verses 1 through 7, if you want to read that ahead of time. Thank you, everybody.